Over the years, Amtrak's paint schemes have remained consistent while still fitting in with the current design trends of the times. Whether it's the bright colors of the 1970s, the blues and grays of the early 2000s, or even the simple designs of the 2020s, it's safe to say that Amtrak's design language is nothing short of iconic. Although generally Amtrak keeps its train liveries or paint jobs pretty consistent, they occasionally paint locomotives into special commemorative paint schemes, such as advertisements, veterans units, or heritage units commemorating Amtrak's paint schemes of the past. Since Amtrak's 40th anniversary in 2011, the railroad has had a handful of modern locomotives painted in old-school paint schemes roaming their system. In 2021, for Amtrak's 50th anniversary, they did the same thing, repainting a few more locomotives into old-school paint schemes. Of all the Amtrak heritage units, not one is electric, meaning that for anyone who spends time on an electrified line, a heritage unit is almost impossible to see, until now when for the first time ever, an electric is wearing a heritage paint scheme. On the morning of December 9th, 2021, a railfan spotted Amtrak ACS-64 number 662 in Washington, D.C., wearing a Phase 3 paint scheme out of nowhere. Many suspected it was a photoshopped image or some other sort of trickery, but later that morning, Amtrak confirmed this news was indeed accurate when they posted pictures of their own on Twitter. They confirmed that Siemens ACS-64 number 662 was wrapped the day before at Amtrak's Ivy City shops with a Phase 3 inspired livery, sponsored by video game developer Dovetail Games. On the side of the locomotive, there was an ad for Train Sim World 2 in addition to an Amtrak 50th anniversary logo, meaning that in addition to being a heritage unit, it's also an advertisement. In fact, it's primarily an advertisement, and thus there would be no Phase 3 ACS-64 if it wasn't for Dovetail Games paying for it. Shortly after these images were publicized, Amtrak announced that 662 would be on that day's Train 176, which is a Northeast regional that departs Washington, D.C. at noon and arrives in Boston in the evening. Let's go see 662 on its maiden voyage. It's around 8 p.m. at Westwood's Route 128 station, one of the last stops that this Northeast regional will be making today, and railfans are lined up on the platform to get their first shots of 662's fresh wrap. Soon enough, an LED light rounds the corner and train 176 pulls into the station running about 20 minutes late. As 176 slowly comes to a halt, we get an up-close and personal look at the wrap on this ACS-64.
And attention please. This is a boarding call for MBTA train 889 scheduled to depart at 8:21 p.m. This train is en route to Closing with intermediate
On the Northeast Corridor, it's a little bit harder to get a good look at these trains since they regularly hit speeds of up to 125 miles per hour, but station stops provide a good place to get photos of the trains at low speed. Anyways, here's the wrap on 662. It pays homage to Amtrak's Phase 3 paint scheme while adding a modern touch with the silhouette of a city on the side of the locomotive, a common motif that shows up quite a bit in TSW2's advertisements. I'll get more into that in a minute, but for now, let's watch as 662 departs the route as it's called by train crews and rail fans alike. Here we get one more look at 662's brand new wrap as it accelerates into the night. As you saw, 662 was wearing a Phase 3 paint job, or wrap, but what was the significance of this? Why do people care so much? Well, in order to truly understand why so many railfans are excited about the 662, we need to learn a little bit more about Amtrak's paint schemes. There are a bunch of videos on YouTube talking about Amtrak's different paint schemes over the years, so I'm not going to get too into the history of Amtrak's liveries, but I will explain a little bit. So Amtrak began service in 1971 when the government took over most privately run passenger trains in the country, and with this they inherited a bunch of old passenger equipment from these railroads. For the first few years, Amtrak didn't have the time nor money to repaint any of this equipment, so this was known as the Rainbow Era because Amtrak's fleet was a hodgepodge of hand-me-down trains, all still sporting the original colors of their former owners. Amtrak soon became known for this, and having old hand-me-down trains was not exactly great for Amtrak's public image. In order to combat this, Amtrak worked to create a comprehensive livery or paint scheme for all of its equipment, and beginning in 1972, Amtrak began painting all of its new equipment into what came to be known as Phase 1, or the Bloody Nose paint scheme. Some notable locomotives that wore this paint job were the SDP-40Fs, which were Amtrak's first locomotives that they bought new. These locomotives soon began to have issues, and so Amtrak ordered more equipment, this time in a different paint scheme that came to be known as Phase 2. When this Phase 2 equipment arrived, it was also deemed to be unreliable, and so the aging inherited locomotives continued to be the backbone of Amtrak's fleet. Desperately looking for a reliable and modern fleet of locomotives, Amtrak ordered EMD F40PH and AEM-7 locomotives, both of which began to be delivered in the mid to late 1970s. These two locomotives quickly proved to be some of Amtrak's best, allowing for the retirement of Amtrak's inherited equipment, which at that point was really old. As these locomotives were being delivered, their paint schemes were modified a bit to better show the white line in Phase 2. This new paint scheme soon came to be known as Phase 3, and it looked quite similar to Phase 2. Phase 3 quickly became Amtrak's most iconic livery, being featured in ads, shows, and even movies. These reliable F40s and AEM-7s powered both Amtrak's diesel and electric trains, and they wore this new Phase 3 paint scheme which lasted from 1976 to 1993. Anyways, being the most iconic Amtrak paint scheme of all time, it's natural that it be painted onto some heritage locomotives, right? Yes, of course. For Amtrak's 40th anniversary, P42DC number 145, P40DC number 822, and F40PH NPCU number 406 were all painted into Phase 3 paint, either directly or indirectly paying homage to the Phase 3 F40 diesels. But the AEM-7s were left unrepresented, even though the AEM-7s wore Phase 3 before the F40PHs did, as the first F40s to be delivered were painted in Phase 2 paint. In 2014, when Amtrak began to replace the AEM-7s with new Siemens ACS-64s, many railfans figured that Amtrak would make some heritage units of these new engines, as the AEM-7s were some of Amtrak's most iconic locomotives, especially when they wore the Phase 3 paint. Unfortunately, all ACS-64s were delivered in Phase 5 paint, with the exception of one veterans unit. For a while, all of Amtrak's heritage units were diesels, which were certainly cool, but many railfans on the Northeast Corridor felt left out, as there were no electric heritage units. Finally though, now we have an ACS-64 heritage unit. Now the AEM-7s wore a total of 3 different paint schemes during their long careers on Amtrak, those being Phase 3, Phase 4, and Phase 5, but generally Phase 3 is considered to be the best looking and most iconic paint scheme ever put onto these locomotives. It was also slightly different than the Phase 3 seen on the F40s, as the AEM-7's rendition of Phase 3 featured a blue line that extended down the front of the locomotive, instead of a blue line with the same width as the red and white ones. I for one think it looks better this way, and so do many other railfans. Anyways, that's why I think 662 is significant. Not only is it Amtrak's first heritage unit, but it also pays homage to the iconic AEM-7s by adopting their earlier variant of Phase 3, which many consider to be one of Amtrak's most iconic liveries. So with that said, let's get trackside again to see 662 in action, this time doing what it does best, going fast. After 662 made its maiden voyage to Boston in a new route, it went south the next morning on 93 and then came back to Boston the next day on 164. Upon arrival in Boston, 662 was taken off the train and staged in Amtrak's Southampton Street yard for some servicing. To the disappointment of many, it stayed in Boston for about a week, not doing anything. Finally, after a week of waiting, word got out that 662 would be leaving Boston on Saturday the 18th. Here we are at Hyde Park Station, one of the southernmost Northeast Corridor stations in Boston. Right before 9 a.m., Amtrak Northeast Regional number 99 rounds the corner. As you saw, 662 was leading the way, with ACS-64 number 600 trailing. Not only was this a double header, which is relatively uncommon on the Northeast Corridor, but it was also a double header of 2 special ACS-64s, those being 662, the Phase 3 wrap, and 600, that one being the David L. Gunn unit, paying tribute to former Amtrak president David L. Gunn. So we've already seen the new heritage unit in action, and I've talked about its significance, so what else is there to talk about? Honestly, not much, but I think one thing I forgot to mention is how in addition to being a real-life locomotive, Dovetail Games also made 662 into an in-game locomotive, releasing a free add-on for the Boston Sprinter route shortly after the real-life locomotive debuted. Additionally, I didn't mention how long Amtrak 662 will stay in this route. In late 2019, Amtrak switched from serving Coca-Cola products to PepsiCo products on its trains, and in order to advertise this, Amtrak wrapped ACS-64 number 606 in a red Coca-Cola wrap. This wrap only lasted a few months, so when the news got out that 662 was wrapped, many thought that the wrap would only last a month or two. But in a recent Railfan and Railroad article, Amtrak officials stated that the wrap would last until at least May 1st, 2022, so that means if you're a rail fan who wants to go see it, you'll have quite a bit of time, although don't expect it to look as clean as it did in my clips, as even after 1 week in service, the wrap had begun to peel in a few spots. So still, try to see it soon, because unless Amtrak repairs the wrap when it starts to peel, it'll look pretty rough basically any time after January or February of 2022. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon in another video. Bye!